Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. We're bringing you the latest news and analysis from a Taiwan perspective. Here's what's coming up.
Today we have taken real steps forward, as Secretary Austin said, in greater Defence Force posture cooperation between our two countries, which will see an increased level of activity between our two countries across all domains.
Australia's Deputy Prime Minister on the move to increase US rotational military presence in Australia. We ask what it means for Taiwan. Then, Taiwan says it will take China to the WTO once again as the economic giant suspends a further 1,000 plus Taiwanese imports. We find out what it all means. And what do deepening ties between the world's top oil exporter and the world's economic powerhouse mean for global politics? We look at Xi Jinping's visit to Saudi Arabia. Plus,
the Chinese were trying to tell a large portion of the Taiwanese population is that if you surrender, if you do not resist, then life could go the way, it has been for you for the past few decades. That is a flat out lie. That's never going to happen.
Kitsch Liao of the Atlantic Council tells me about the propaganda Beijing feeds to Taiwanese. Welcome to the show. I'm Yin Khvat. Our guests today are William Stanton, former American Institute in Taiwan director and National Chengchi University professor, chair, and former US Embassy Australia deputy chief of mission and chargé d'affaires, and Lu Yeh-chung, National Chengchi University Department of Diplomacy chair and professor. And earlier I spoke to Kitsch Liao, Atlantic Council's Global China Hub Assistant Director, previously Taiwan's Institute of National Defense and Security Research Analyst, also formerly US Congress and US Defense postings. He's also ex-Australian Strategic Policy Institute consultant. Ambassador Stanton, Professor Lu, a very warm welcome to the show today. We begin the show with the announcement by the United States and Australia of an increase to US defense posture in Australia.
Today we agreed to deepen our defense cooperation in several important ways, including enhancing our force posture cooperation. And based upon today's talks, we will increase rotational presence of U.S. forces in Australia. That includes rotations of bomber task forces, fighters, and future rotations of U.S. Navy and U.S. Army capabilities. We'll also expand our logistics and sustainment cooperation, and that will deepen our interoperability and create more agile and resilient capabilities.
So, Professor Lu, if I can start with you. We don't have all the details of this arrangement, but in your view, how significant was this announcement?
I think it is quite important for Australia and the United States to cooperate, especially on security issues. As the Australian Defense Minister indicated during the meeting, he says that China's dangerous and coercive actions are actually threatening regional peace and stability. I think this is a shared concern between Australia and the United States.
So why now?
I think it is quite important to notice that after Xi Jinping consolidated his own power within the CCP, and also because right now we are witnessing a year, maybe we can see that as a gap year between any big meaningful elections in this region. So I think this is quite important for all countries to seize this great moment to move on, to collaborate on security issues.
Ambassador Stanton, so it's a direct response to Xi Jinping's third term?
I think so. It's increasingly important that, as many leaders in the United States have noted, that we exercise deterrence. Increasingly, Beijing has shown that it's willing to threaten, to intimidate, to send these gray zone aircraft and ships to surround Taiwan. It's taken, Xi Jinping has also, taken a very tough line, calling on the military to get ready to fight. This kind of rhetoric, bellicose rhetoric on the part of the leader of China, I think has grabbed everyone's attention. And it's essential, I think, now that the United States step up its game in the region, Certainly with Australia, Australia was punished, we have to remember, simply because they asked for an honest investigation of the causes of the COVID virus. As a result, millions and millions of dollars of exports from Australia were simply stopped. So this kind of economic coercion as well, which we now see directed against Taiwan, all of these factors taken into account, I think it's very important that the US and our allies, Australia, certainly maybe in the future, Japan, that we all unite in opposition to what's happening.
Professor Lu, so Ambassador there mentioned deterrence and also the bellicose language that had come out of Beijing and Xi Jinping. But there had been also the meeting between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping where there was sort of like a de-escalation of tensions, right? And also, you know, this resolve to manage competition responsibly. So how do you see this announcement? And how does that play into how Xi Jinping is seeing global affairs right now?
Right. I think it is quite important to highlight the importance of the Biden-Xi Jinping meeting at the G20. And also the Australian Prime Minister Albanese also met Xi Jinping at G20. Both meetings actually highlights the three parties. They want to have a managed competition, rather than we go all the way to conflict, those kind of mentality. But what is important is, while meeting with Xi Jinping, I think the United States, along with Australia and other countries, they are sending a very clear and consistent signal that on economic issues, we can collaborate or manage our competition. But on security issues, there are some rules to follow. So this is quite important. Let me give our audience an example. The Economist, actually, after the G20 meeting, the magazine issued an article entitled "Australia Emerges from China's Doghouse," saying that there seems to be a chance for both sides to somehow mitigate the worsening economic relationship. However, in the meantime, Australia still sticks to its very clear security policy vis-a-vis China. Yeah, so I think this is quite important. We are not sending a mixed signal to China. We are sending clearly, we can cooperate, we can manage our competition. But on the other hand, you need to follow the rules, the norms.
All right. Ambassador Stanton, do you agree with that? It's security-wise, sending a very clear message, whereas economic-wise, which we will get to, that we can cooperate. Can you also touch on what this means for Taiwan?
Well, Taiwan still faces the fundamental problem because it doesn't have that alternative to say, well, we can disagree on security, but we can make progress on the economy. Well,
in terms of Taiwan contingents, because there's also obviously AUKUS, yeah. So the nuclear-powered submarines, which essentially enable Australia to reach Taiwan,
right?
Whereas any other submarines would not be able to.
Well, but the other thing is now they're going to be rotating aircraft, fighter aircraft and other aircraft into the, probably into Darwin, the north coast of Australia, which means that the US is not so far away in the event of a crisis if there's an outbreak of fighting of some kind.
And how about the rotational presence? Is that also key? So it's not a permanent presence, it's a temporary rotational presence.
Well, I think for one thing, it gives more troops and more of our military an opportunity and experience to get to be familiar with air bases, familiar with their counterparts in Australia. So that's one virtue of it. The other virtue is that it also doesn't send signals that we're setting up a permanent base, which, you know, there's always political opposition to that kind of thing. Although I know, since we're going to be talking about Saudi Arabia later, we have bases virtually all of the Saudi Peninsula countries, so including in Saudi Arabia, although it's fairly small at this point, I think. So I think it's a wise move, it's a measured move. and we'll see what happens in the future. Maybe it'll become more permanent if necessary.
Okay. Still to come in the show.
China, as the second largest economy in the world, as our largest trading partner, will continue to play an important role in our plans, in our progress towards economic diversification away from oil, in building a larger, stronger, more resilient economy. So we will continue to work with all of our partners, and we don't see it as a zero-sum game by any means.
The Saudis say they can continue to engage strongly with the United States while courting its biggest rival, China. We discuss what impact that may have. First, Taiwan is reeling from the latest round of import bans from Beijing, which had brought the total number of banned Taiwanese imports to more than 2,000 in the space of a few days. Now, following Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August this year, China slapped bans on around 1,000 products. Now let's take a look. China started last year with fruit, with pineapples, sugar apples, wax apples, and this year they added fish in terms of grouper, as well as some other citrus. This report by Taiwan Plus News' Rick Lowett and Howard Zhang.
It's an uncertain time for Taiwan's largest beer and liquor company. The makers of Taiwan beer have been hit by an import ban from China. It's the latest in a slew of economic actions against Taiwan.
在中国市场的部分，因为可能有一些因素干扰，那造成我们对中国市场的不确定性太多，所以我们的公司策略是从几年前就了解这个问题，所以我们公司的策略就是赶快去开发更多的国际市场来补强。
China claims Taiwan as part of its territory and has upped threats to take the country by force. It's conducted military drills around the island nation and continues to send over military planes and ships. As relations between Beijing and Taipei worsen, China is increasingly slapping bans on Taiwanese products and produce. First it was fruit, then fish, now it's alcohol. China has instituted new customs regulations that it now says Taiwanese exporters are failing to fulfill. Before suspending shipments of 100 types of alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages, it also widened the number of seafood shut out of the market.
我们有去问说那到底是什么样不合，但是我们没有得到答案。我们也去做比较过了，我们也找不出这个逻辑。
Taiwanese authorities have urged China to remove trade barriers and said they will take the issue to the World Trade Organization.
尤其对台湾更是特别严格、特别歧视，不但时间缩短，而且都是对台湾要求这个要求那个。
The country's foreign minister, in the meantime, shrugged off the latest act of economic coercion from Beijing, saying they don't know what they're missing, the great taste of freedom. Taiwan now faces pressure from Beijing on many fronts, militarily, politically and economically. And it's determined to take this latest development in its stride. Howard Chang, Rick Lowett for Taiwan Plus.
That report by Howard Zhang and Rick Lowett. Professor Lu, China's bans tend to be acts of coercion. So let's take what Ambassador already mentioned, actually, Australia calling for the COVID origins inquiry, or Lithuania allowing Taiwan to open a representative office in Vilnius with the name Taiwanese. So what has triggered this latest round of bans towards Taiwan?
Yes, in the case of China this time, China's General Administration of Customs, they say that they already introduced the new registration system in April 2021, and which aims to be effective on January 1st, 2022. So from their perspective, they are saying that we already give you certain kind of grace period for almost 12 months. But to me, I would say, because this is always part of China's strategy vis-a-vis Taiwan. So when to do it, how to do it, that was the key part to comprehend the whole question. To me, I would say this time, China sees the opportunity to further using this economic pressure on Taiwan, trying to let Taiwanese people understand, okay, right now this is a time that the business community should say something against the Taiwan's government. So we can also take this as part of China's economic statecraft vis-a-vis Taiwan as well. But I think even though China continued to argue the Beijing government actually announced the whole thing to the whole world. Taiwan is part of the world, something like that. But we all know that this has very strong political meanings for cross-strait relations. So to me, I would say in the following few months, maybe we will witness more and more this kind of measures from the Chinese side.
So the end goal, what's the end goal of Beijing doing this?
I would say they are trying to create, or at least nurture, an atmosphere in Taiwan, trying to let people unsatisfied with the current government. Yeah.
Okay. Of Taiwan's 890 fish products registered with China's General Administration of Customs, all but one have been suspended or cancelled. Let's take a look at this graphic at Taiwan's grouper exports. You can see there that Taiwan's annual output was 17,000 tons in 2021, and about a third of that is exported. In this next diagram, we can see here that of all the exports, 91% go to China. So, Ambassador, just want to pick up on what Professor Lu said there. You know, it's clear that Beijing wants to squeeze the certain industries. You know, first of all, we saw agriculture, there's fishing now, and then, as Professor mentioned, the business people. You know, these the latest sort of liquor, beer, Kavalan whiskey is King Car. You know, these are Taiwanese businessmen.
Well, you know, it's not because they don't like Taiwanese products. I remember visiting the Gaoliang distillery in Jinmen, and I was talking to one of the supervisors there and said, "What's your biggest problem for Jinmen Gaoliang?" He said, "There's so much counterfeiting on the mainland." So it's clearly the products are excellent and they're appreciated, but this is clearly a political effort on the part of China to put more pressure on Taiwan, to make people, and particularly the business community, increasingly unhappy with the direction of things. You know, Taiwan is unfortunate. Its great advantage in previous years economically has been it's close to China. But that's meant that 40% of its exports in general go to China. So its greatest disadvantage now is that it's become so dependent on China. And of course, President Tsai tried to change that in creating this Go South policy. But, you know, it hasn't gone far enough or fast enough. And so Taiwan continues to need to seek other alternatives to just doing business with China, because I don't think that China's going to let up the pressure, release it.
As the professor said. So, you know, where does this, you talk about dependent, that Taiwan is dependent on China, but are they actually dependent? They can find other markets for their produce, and therefore they are not so dependent. I mean, let's talk about the other, the cases. So the Taiwan government has said that it would take China to the WTO. There's also at the WTO cases against China from the EU and also Australia that we already mentioned. So what is the logical conclusion of this? If these countries, these areas, they don't want to be so dependent on China, they will find other markets.
Well, that's what we would hope. Unfortunately, WTO has not been a very forceful mechanism for resolving these kinds of conflicts. I mean, China, for example, has just recently drawn up a case against the United States because we've cut off the supply from the US, not only of advanced computer chips, but also of personnel who make the computer chips.
But there's a national security issue. It's slightly different. There's a legal basis to that.
You're absolutely right, but we might have a better case with the WTO. But looking back, I don't think the WTO has been very successful in forcing trading nations to have fair trade.
Okay. Professor Lu, Politico, interestingly, recently named Eric Huang, who's Taiwan's ambassador, representative to Lithuania as one of the most influential, its list of the most influential people in Europe. So, you know, what can we say about how China's coercion is being viewed by the world?
Yes, let me borrow one of the saying from Mao Zedong. He once said, where there is oppression, there is resistance. Once you have Chinese pressure against all those countries, they would, I wouldn't say automatically, but they would treasure Taiwan's presence more. So I think this Beijing government should think about this more thoroughly. On the WTO issue, I would like to add one thing. Actually, until today, China, under the DSM, the dispute settlement mechanism within WTO, China right now was involved in 49 cases as the respondents, which means people trying to sue against China. China filed 22 cases, against other partners. Yes. So you can see that there seems to be a trend that many countries, while engaging with China economically, they found that economic or business practices are just not following international standards. So this is a big issue to China. And also for Taiwan's involvement in the WTO process. Right now, even though the Chinese government exerts so many bans on Taiwan's products, but Taiwanese government didn't go to the DSM against China. The Taiwanese government was saying we would go to the SPS committee. It's called the Committee on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures.
So to do with food safety?
Yes, with food safety. So it's more like a process. And for many countries, even though they are involved in trade disputes with China, their main idea was trying to encourage China to negotiate for a better deal.
Sort of bilaterally as opposed to going to the WTO.
Right, because as the ambassador just mentioned, the DSM under WTO is just so insufficient and ineffective.
Ambassador, I wanted to pick up on something that Professor said. So he's saying that it's very clear that this is politically motivated, that Beijing wants to put pressure on the businesses to turn against the Taiwanese government. So they in fact want to say, you know, you cannot have economic cooperation with us unless you have political integration. Is that the message?
I think political subjugation is the word I would use. You know, if, I think it was mentioned earlier, if China takes over, I mean, it's just a pipe dream to think that people could go on living their lives as before here in Taiwan. We can see in any authoritarian state, it's a complete transformation of that society. So, you know, that's the concern that Taiwanese people, I think, also have. I've noticed in recent polls the number of people who really don't want to give up their identity, don't want to give up their freedom, you know, is very high. I think there's only 5% I saw in a recent poll who identified with China. So it's going to be a real struggle, but I think one of the things that's important is the support of the United States, other democracies, Australia, Japan, other friends and allies around the world who can help Taiwan. And Taiwan's doing a lot of the right things. You mentioned the ambassador to one of the Baltic states. You know, this is actually, I've talked to somebody who's involved in that. Taiwan has a very innovative program where they're you know, seeking out companies that have ideas for investment, and Taiwan's established a fund to help fund those ideas and to help, you know, bring them to fruition. And that's proving very attractive to these smaller countries, which also know what it's like to be under threat, because they, of course, fear that after Ukraine, they would be next.
Absolutely. So there's parallels, isn't it, between Russia and China and the former Soviet states. Professor Lu, if I could just end on you for this segment. Let's go back to Joseph Wu's comments. You know, they're missing out. They're missing out on the great taste of freedom. What's your view?
Yeah, I totally agree with that saying because we all know that Taiwan beer is one of the fine products around the world.
And Taiwan whiskey too.
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Still to come in the show, Kitsch Liao tells me how Taiwanese need to educate themselves about what he says will be the real story if China takes Taiwan.
I don't think enough people actually spend the effort to paint a picture of, for example, what a post-invasion Taiwan would look like, even under the best of circumstances. Mass concentration camps, mass executions, or maybe some people just believe like if they don't get too political, they could get on with their lives.
But first, Xi Jinping has heralded a so-called new era in relations with Saudi Arabia on a state trip to the country. Saudi statements also said Arab-Chinese ties were entering a new phase. Xi and Saudi King Salman signed a series of strategic deals valued at around $30 billion US, according to Saudi state media. One deal involves US-banned Huawei and builds on the 5G networks the Chinese tech giant is already installing in the region. Xi's attendance at 2 milestone Gulf Arab leaders summits and the pomp and ceremony of his reception came in stark contrast to the visit of US President Joe Biden in July. President Xi told Gulf Arab leaders that China would work to buy oil and gas in yuan in order to establish Beijing's currency internationally, thereby weakening the US dollar. Any move by Riyadh to ditch the dollar in its oil trade would be a seismic political move, according to Reuters. Professor Lu, China has billed this trip as epoch-making. So what do you think of all the hype?
It is quite important for us to notice that Xi's visit beginning on December 7th throughout the 10th of December. And during the meeting, actually, he not only met with the leader of Saudi Arabia, but also many other Arabian countries. It is also quite important to notice that both sides, China and Saudi Arabia, announced that they are going to be comprehensive strategic partners in the future. Even though this is I would say, it's more like an empty slogan in Chinese foreign policy in general. However, we can see that this is at least a marriage of convenience between China and Saudi Arabia, because China has long been the largest trading partner to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is China's most important oil provider. But this time we can see that China wants to position itself better in the Gulf area. Saudi Arabia wants to offset US pressure on OPEC. So I would say this is more like a marriage of convenience.
So their goals are actually aligned. Essentially, neither of them is happy with the US. They're quite keen to edge the US out of the region.
Right.
Ambassador.
Well, you know, epoch making, I don't think so, because if you look back in 2017, the first trip that President Donald Trump made abroad was to Saudi Arabia. And he was received like an emperor from a foreign land. I mean, they bestowed medals on him. They
had fighter jets accompanying him.
Yeah, fighter jets. They pulled out all the stops, probably surpassing what has now happened. And in return, you know, President Trump would hear no ill about the Saudis, even as they were becoming more and more like China in the sense of moving toward becoming a more authoritarian state with a single person in charge, Mohammed bin Salman. So in addition, you know, the behavior of the Saudis is not unlike that of China in its own region. China has a lot of difficulties. It's the big guy on the block in East Asia. And so it has struggles against India. It has problems, has had problems in the past with the Russian border. You know, in the same way that Mohammed bin Salman has, of course, supported a war directed indirectly against Iran in Yemen. It's also at one point tried to take over Qatar. To make it sort of a province of Saudi Arabia. So all the other Gulf states are unhappy with it. So you see a behavioral patterns in both Saudi Arabia and in China.
Yeah, and we also must mention the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, who was a journalist and a government critic,
right,
you know, who was brutally murdered in the Saudi embassy in Turkey.
And precisely because of that, the U.S., once it realized that this murder had been committed, the relationship began to fall apart a little bit with Saudi Arabia. It wasn't all flowers and sweets. And as a result of that, Mohammed bin Salman was not so happy with the U.S. anymore. Once it was no longer Trump who was in charge and Biden was coming in. And so he's been looking for an alternative. So it's not exactly just a choice of trying to balance, but it's in a way, I think, sort of getting back at the U.S. a bit, because the U.S. made such a big, as it should be, big human rights case out of a government-ordered or king-ordered execution of a critic. So it's been a real shift in what our policy's been in the U.S. towards Saudi Arabia as well. So that said, I don't think Saudi Arabia is going to put all of its eggs in the China basket.
Yeah, because the U.S. is the main sort of military backer, right, the arms supplier to Riyadh. And so could China, you know, step into these boots?
Well, it might, but you know, the problem is you can't just mix apples and oranges, which is what happens when you bring in new weapons systems and you've got old weapons systems. But it's more than that. Underlying it all, we know, even though that Saudi Arabia has taken a fairly benign view of what's happening in Xinjiang and the treatment of Muslims, we have to remember that basically, you know, China is a communist state, and it doesn't have any truck with any religions, much less with the Muslim faith. People of the Muslim faith are being persecuted. So I don't think it's a marriage made in heaven between Saudi Arabia and China. I think there are a lot of fundamental differences in values. The common value they have is they both have leaders who want total control.
Absolutely. Professor Lu, because both sides actually released statements talking about you know, supporting non-interference. And of course, this is something that China positions itself very well in terms of non-interference into our internal affairs, obviously related to Taiwan.
Yes, yes. Of course, we can see that from the Chinese side, they continue to say these 5 principles for peaceful coexistence. One of them is non-interference. So from the Chinese perspective, of course, if right now, especially when Xi Jinping entered his 3rd term, it is quite important for him to highlight the importance of China's great rejuvenation, which include recovering Taiwan. So this, of course, would be again a statement for Saudi Arabia to say and in support of China's position. But I totally agree with Ambassador what he just said, because I think it is also very important for us to notice during this dyadic relationship between Saudi Arabia and China, we can see that they have certain things in common, but all in all, they are not going to be friends in the near future.
Right. Ambassador, let's talk about Xi Jinping's intent to use yuan to buy the oil and gas from Saudis. How likely is this?
I think it's a non-starter. They've been making efforts along those lines in the past. The problem is it's the international currency is the dollar, and so many countries are now invested in the dollar, including China. Its reserves are in dollars.
Including Saudi.
Including the Saudis. So, you know, taking on the UN might be a little bit like taking on cryptocurrency. You just don't know what would happen, what the valuation would be. So, you know, the dollar has been time tested, and it's the international currency, I think, everywhere. So to change that, you know, the problem is you could start taking UN, and then what can you buy? And initially, anyway, and maybe for the continuing into the future, the only thing you could buy would be Chinese products with UN.
Possibly some Russian projects?
Probably
now
in the near future.
Maybe.
Yeah. I mean, Professor, I would like to ask you, so, where does this leave Russia? Because, Russia was the major, or still is, major oil energy exporter. Now China is being courted or is courting Saudi Arabia.
Yes. I think China is trying to have a better position vis-a-vis the OPEC, the United States, Russia, all other major great powers around the world. But one thing is about the fact, by one count, in terms of foreign reserve, there are more than 58% of the foreign reserve are calculated in US dollars. So this is the basic facts. So it is quite important if Beijing decides to de-link or cut off the ties between yuan and US dollars, that will be a disaster to Beijing as well. Actually, there are some scholars in Beijing has already noticed this kind of possible situation in the future.
Good points.
Right. And Ambassador, the rial, the currency of Saudi Arabia and also the other Gulf nations, is also pegged
to the dollar.
To the US dollar.
Yeah, it's a problem. I think it's not going to be an easy trick, but I think Xi Jinping is desperate to sort of usurp the US position, the US dollar's position in the world. But I think it's not going to be an easy task. I don't think the European countries, for example, who are probably most important in terms of their assets, would be interested in doing that. The US would not. So, I don't know, taken together, that's a good portion of the world's economy, or at least its wealth.
Professor Lu, one of the deals that was signed this time round was with Huawei, which is the controversial Chinese tech giant. They, of course, have been banned by the US and other allies, including the UK. How significant is that for Huawei?
I think for the Chinese government calculation, they really hope to have Huawei around the world, trying to sell it to all other countries. However, as we know, according to the US passing several laws last year and also this year, Huawei and equipments with Huawei hardware or even software are difficult to be purchased in democracies around the world. So I believe for the Beijing government, they are trying to sell it to the authoritarian regimes. That would be a great outlet for their product.
So this is a real sort of the fragmentation that we're seeing in the global supply chains, democracy versus autocracy. Ambassador?
Well, there's another point, which would be that according to reports I've seen on YouTube and elsewhere, Mohammed bin Salman himself has undertaken a great deal of hacking of his own population among the Saudis. Huawei, which has such a disreputable reputation, if that was brought in, he might be afraid that they would then have access to all of their computers, all of their exchanges, and that would be a frightening prospect. So I'm not so sure that the Saudis would welcome with open arms Huawei. I mean,
so you think that they would limit the cooperation? Because I understand it's in cloud computing, which that would seem to have access to, vital information.
Right, everything. So I think they might be skeptical because it's been a tool of the Saudi government under President bin Salman that they have access to everyone's accounts in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. So why would you want to provide the same sort of backdoor key to China? It might be problematic.
Yes, that's right. And Professor Lu, I mean, the other authoritarian states that have welcomed Huawei, surely this is a concern for them too?
Yes, of course. And especially they are not sure about each other's intention, especially in the long run. So I believe everyone is, while receiving China's help or assistance, they would definitely pay attention to this issue area.
Thank you very much to our guests today, Ambassador Stanton and Professor Lu. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, in November, a Taiwanese army colonel accused of spying for China sent shockwaves through Taiwan society. In our final extended interview today, I discussed with Kitsch Liao, an assistant director at Atlantic Council's Global Hub, whether this case points to broader divisions in Taiwan's military and how Taiwanese can arm themselves against Beijing's propaganda. Kitsch has extensive military and defense experience both in the US Department of Defense, Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and Taiwan's Institute of National Defense and Security Research. Let's take a look. Recently, there was an army colonel, Shang, in Taiwan's military accused of spying for China. How significant was this?
I would say, like, operationally speaking, it has certain significance, especially comparing with other cases, because he is not just a colonel, but his position is with the Operational Development Office under Doctrine Command in the infantry school. These are the people who's actually coming up with writing manuals, coming up with doctrines for infantry advances and such. And so this is problematic in many ways. But I want to also talk a little bit about like why this is the case and why the blame does not basically, always falls with the people who's committing these crimes. But the way our current classification system works revolves around essentially group punishment for leaks. If all of these, like, for example, in a school, like, you got a bunch of people with access to classified information. If one of them leaks, everybody got punished because they were talking about they don't have enough resources to conduct background checks for every one of them. Now, this has the unfortunate effect of basically like silencing the wrong people. This people who wants the system to be better, they want to reflect this, and they're silenced because even information that's tangentially related might be used to punish the group.
So they can hide behind, the guilty can hide behind the innocent, essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah. Do you think this case also points to a broader question of exactly how unified Taiwan's military is in defending against China?
I would say basically the military is a reflection of the society that it's in. The conflict you see in the Taiwanese military also exists in the broader society in Taiwan. So this is a much larger conversation.
So it's a microcosm, reflection of wider society. So what's the solution to this for Taiwan at this very critical point where we are facing the threat of China seeking to annex Taiwan?
The solution is basically for the Taiwanese people to realize what the Chinese Communist Party actually represents, how they run their society. I think there's a very dangerous propensity to think that we understand the Chinese more than almost everyone else because we share the same language. But we don't. We don't speak, we don't do party speak. We don't understand what the Chinese Communist Party means through their doctrines, through their books, through their papers. We just think we actually understand what they're saying.
And how do Taiwanese people get that education? Obviously, self-education, but is there a role that government needs to play in this? I mean, can we draw any comparisons with Ukraine? I mean, Ukraine was also a society with a large population of Russians or pro-Russians, and yet the majority of them have resisted and not wanted to be taken over by Russia.
I think one of the most dangerous propagandas that the Chinese were trying to tell a large portion of the Taiwanese population is that if you surrender, if you do not resist, then life could go the way, it has been for you for the past few decades. That is a flat out lie. That's never going to happen. I don't think enough people actually spent the effort to paint a picture of, for example, what a post-invasion Taiwan would look like, even under the best of circumstances. Mass concentration camps, mass executions, or maybe some people just believe like if they don't get too political, they could get on with their lives. But that's not the plan. That's not how it would go. We need to actually have more on what China wants to do with Taiwan after they took over Taiwan.
Taiwan's Mainland Affairs Council released a report where they said that China actually wants to normalize military exercises with ASEAN members. I wanted to ask you, so how does this play into any invasion, any contingency around Taiwan, or does it play into that?
So I believe the last example of actually joint exercise was between China and the PLAF, the People's Liberation Army Air Force, and the Royal Air Force. And there are two main points I want to make, right? First of all, first one is the technical and operational concern, and the second one is the strategic concern. Technical operational concern. The Royal Air Force, the Thai Royal Air Force operates Western equipment. They have JS-39 Gripen C and D models. They have F-16s from the US, and they actually devoted their Gripen fighters into the exercise with the PLAF. PLAF doesn't actually have much exposure to Western equipment. Mostly they have access to information, theoretical information. They have some exchanges with the German Air Force. And of course, they can get information and exercise from the Pakistanis through their F-16s. But this was the first time where they actually get to do this in an open exercise. Exposures for Chinese pilots that were actually in the exercise, for Chinese planners that were part of the exercise. This is extremely valuable experience for them. And this could translate into what their plans for in terms of countering Taiwan, in terms of countering US intervention. And this should be like of particular concern to the Taiwan Air Force, because our playbook are essentially the same as the Thai Air Force. It's all from the US. So for this information to be somewhat, compromised and basically like somewhat, circulated around the Chinese Air Force, we need to at least think about the possibility and the potential to counter this. Now, on the strategic side, what this introduces, because joint military exercise is a relatively significant statement on the relationship between the two countries. This introduces additional doubts and basically disrupt potential regional alignment in creating a coalition to exert pressures on China to behave, essentially. And this is what the US has been trying to do since the Obama era. But that doesn't mean there's nothing Taiwan can do, right? Just as there's like monetary talks and defense review talks on the military side, I think it is long past due for Taiwan to consider diplomatic efforts as part of its national security strategy. We don't do this enough.
So you think pushing along the diplomatic lines really, rather than attempting to have any sort of joint military exercises with the US and another partner, why is it that Taiwan is at this incredible disadvantage, unable to have joint military exercises, say, with Japan?
Having joint exercises is pretty much the privilege of basically, a sovereign entity.